You guys got your popcorn out? Sit back, relax. Look at Ruth, look at me like, what's she talking about? Whoops. I told everyone that was here last week that my message today was, the name of it was going to be Sad Songs. I like songs. That's the reason I love to do music here. But every time I go to the book of Psalms, so that's what we're going to speak on today, is I'd like for everyone to go to the book of Psalms 51, please. And we're going to read verses 1 through 8. It kind of starts out, it's really a book of songs, okay? It's kind of like country songs, where you have love songs and where you have happy songs. And in this particular time, we're going to talk about a sad song. And this is a song that David was singing, which was a very sad song. So that was my title today. Let's turn in our Bibles to chapter 51, and we're going to read 1 through 8, please. He says, "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you, you only have I sinned, and done this evil in your sight, that you may be found just when you speak, and blameless when you judge. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. Behold, you desire truth in the inward parts, and in the hidden part you will make me to know wisdom. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Make me hear joy and gladness, that the bones that you have broken may rejoice." It kind of starts out that when David sinned against God, when David was all alone on the balcony, he looked across the horizon and he seen Bathsheba naked, and that's when the sin begins. He didn't only break his own heart, he broke God's heart. This song today is a sad song about David, because one day David decided to play hooky. It was in the springtime, and the rest of the army was out doing a war. But David was doing some R&R. He's taking a break. He didn't go out and fight like the rest of the army did. He was just staying back, chilling out. He stayed in bed all day. He got up, decided to get up that evening. And he went out on the balcony, and he looked out on this rooftop. Here it was, this absolute beautiful, absolute knockout, beautiful woman bathing on this rooftop. Now, what David should have done was just go back in the palace and kind of mind his own business. He didn't do a 180, he did a 360. He He brings her home, brings her up to the palace. They have a one-night stand, and he gets her pregnant. He brings home the husband, trying to get him to sleep with her, so he would never know it was his child. But the husband said no, he wasn't going to. So David has him murdered on the battlefield. David then, he takes her to be his wife. But what happens was one night stand had just exploded. In a chain reaction like all sin ultimately does. In stealing, adultery, and murder, you name it. He's going from a godly king to a murderer. David was about to learn the same lesson that we all learn. That the devil brings up temptation almost every day of our lives. And here's the way it works. The devil will tempt you when God comes into your life. David broke 4 out of 10 commandments just in one night. The devil and temptation never play fair. The devil will say, you can get away with this. Then just as soon as you do it, he'll say, you'll never get away with this. What he'll do, he will trip you and then blame you for falling. David decides he's going to cover this up. And nobody will ever know the difference. Right now, God is dealing with David. God is plotting David. God is poking David. And David is witnessing the worst day of his life. David is sick. He's sick because of what is called sin sickness. When God enters into your life, he makes you more sensitive to sin. It's like when you go to the eye doctor and he puts those eye drops in. Then afterwards, your eyes are so sensitive. You can hardly stand it, they're so sensitive. You look up at the sun, you can't stand it because they're so sensitive. That's why when God steps into your life, that sin becomes so sensitive into your life. That's what the Holy Spirit does when it enters into your body. You're more sensitive to sin. He doesn't fix you where you can't sin anymore. He makes you more sensitive to sin. You have the mark of a healthy body. When it wants to fight infection, when you have an infection, that's why sometimes we got a fever. A fever is a sign in your body that knows that infection doesn't belong there. And your body is doing everything it can to fight that infection. A healthy believer is one that wants to get rid of the sin when it experiences it. Everybody is born in sin. Keep your Bibles open to Psalm 51. I'd like to read verse 5 again. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me, it said. Everybody is born in sin, he's saying. David said, surely I've been born with the sin at birth. When I was born, I was carrying this sin in my body. This teacher one day was trying to teach her children that everybody is born in sin. And the teacher said, if everyone believes it, to raise their hand. And everyone raised their hand but one. It's always one, isn't it? It's usually little Johnny, but it was a little girl named Taylor. And the teacher asked Taylor, you don't believe this? My parents told me that I was born in November. We found out that Taylor wasn't too swift. If you're under 50, you'll get it. We're all born in sin. It's universal. It's not because that we've all got it, but God is the only cure for it. There's no therapy, there's no doctor that can cure sin sickness. Only God can. But if you have a healthy, godly conscience, but if you don't, all bets are off. But if you have a healthy, godly conscience, David is saying, let us look in verse 2. It says, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. David is saying, would you just cleanse me, Lord? Would you just give me a cleansing shower? Just cleanse me from my filth. The first thing he asked God to do wasn't to forgive him. He's saying, God, cleanse me. Would you just give me a spiritual shower? Would you just cleanse me from my filth? Anytime that David walked out on the palace and you looked at him, man, he was pristine. He looked pure, wearing the best sandals that money could buy and beautiful crown of gold, jewels sparkled so bright that you could see miles away. He was always freshly bathed, always clean. He looked like $1 million. But inside he felt filthy and he felt dirty. You say, why did he feel dirty? Because he was dirty. Why was he filthy? Because he was filthy. Because sin is dirty and sin is filthy. And sin makes us dirty. If you're really walking with God and you're close to God and you have a relationship with God, it doesn't matter if it's a little sin, a big sin, or just a great sin. It will make you feel dirty. When God comes into your life, you don't fix it where you don't sin. He'll fix it where you don't want to sin no more. Back in Bible times, when the ladies used to clean their clothes, their garments, they would go down to the river, the creek, or the lake. They would wash their clothes there and take a rock and literally beat those rocks against the clothes to get all the filth out of the clothes. David is saying to Jesus, Lord, I don't want to be dirty and I don't want sin in my soul ever. Then he said, cleanse me, Lord. Would you just do a sin detox on me? I am sick and tired of being sick and tired of living with my sin. I don't want to see my sin anymore, and I don't want to smell my sin anymore. David thought he left his sin go. You may think that you left your sin go. But if you have a relationship with God, sin won't let you go. Do you know why sin won't let you go? Because God won't let you go. David was living by the ghost of guilt. David would go to bed thinking about sin. He would go to bed thinking about guilt. He'd eat breakfast thinking about sin. He'd take a ride on his horse and his chariot thinking about that sin. He'd go to lunch thinking about that sin. He would keep appointments thinking about that sin. He would play music on his harp thinking about that sin. It was absolutely dominating his mind. Everywhere David went, sin was sure to go. That's just the way sin will affect the believer. You may think that you put that sin out the back door of your mind, but it'll come through the front door. You would always be constantly reminded of it. Sin dominates the mind to where you can't stand it no more. Then it disheartens your heart. You're not only emotionally sickened, then it will affect you spiritually. Let's look at verse 8 if we could, please. It says, "Make me hear your joy and gladness, that the bones that you have broken may rejoice." David wanted to hear joy and gladness. When something happens to us, a lot of times we'll say, "Man, I was just crushed." You see, up until David messed up, he and God were just like that. He was a man after God's own heart. They FaceTime together. They Skype before bedtime. But no longer after what David did, God didn't hear joy and gladness like he did before. He heard judgment and sadness in God's voice. Keep in mind that's what sin sickness does. When a believer is living right, but a healthy believer is sad when he's living wrong. Sin is always a drag on the spirit. If you are a healthy Christian, and you'll be an unhappy sinner. Just as surely as night follows day, as a believer, sorrow follows sin. Just as surely as bad food gives you indigestion, sin brings sadness. 3 people had known about this sin. Bathsheba, she knew about the sin. She was the adulteress. Of course, David knew about it. Then Joab, the commander of the army, knew about it, who helped David to have the husband murdered. But David had to live the guilt of sin every single day. David was living with a spiritual fear. He was in solitary confinement. I have just been crushed. It zaps the heart of your day, and it sucks the gladness out of your heart. It pumps sadness into your heart. David had dishonored the Lord. Sin dishonored the Lord. Just logic alone ought to tell us something, that if we love God like we ought to love God, and we ought to have with God, logic tells you to avoid sin like the plague. You would never want to sin. You would never want to step in that cesspool of sin because of what it does. So look what David says. Let's look at verse 4 if we could, please. It says, against you, you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight, that you may be found just when you speak. David said, he's talking to God. It was God that David sinned against. It wasn't Bathsheba, even though she sinned. It was God that David sinned against. It wasn't Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. David is looking to God right now and he says, you're the one I sinned against. I read somewhere, I don't know where I read this, I found it. It said only 17% of the people in America understand sin in the relationship with God. 83% said, oh, everything I do has nothing to do with God. When you break a human law, it's a crime. When you break God's law, you commit a sin. And murder is a crime, but it's a sin. Stealing is a crime against your neighbor, but it's also a sin in God's law. There's no such thing as a secret sin. Nobody ever gets away with it. If you sin verbally, God hears it. If you sin mentally, God knows it. And if you sin physically, he sees it. Here's the problem. David said, what I did to her and what I did to him, I didn't just break the law, I broke your heart. In closing, David says, God, I brought dishonor into you. I didn't just bring disgrace to myself. I brought disgrace to my family. I didn't just bring disgrace to the kingdom. And I didn't just bring disgrace to the people. I disgraced you, the one who created me. So we find out that sin isn't too helpful to the mind, is it? Unless you have God to forgive all of your sin. Let's praise and worship him through maybe a little bit better song.